We don't need the lights down. Yes, 2 short talks this evening, starting with Star of Bethlehem. I'm sure we're all familiar with the idea of the Star of Bethlehem. I'm going to remind you, in case you're not familiar, with what's in the Gospel of St. Matthew about the Star of Bethlehem. And then I'll be asking, are there any astronomical candidates? In other words, do anything that we understand about what was in the sky 2,000 years ago, is there anything there that might conceivably have been the source of the narrative of the Star of Bethlehem? And we'll be asking ourselves whether the dates match up to the dates of the Nativity. Then I'll be using some planetarium software, the sort that you can get on an app on your phone or your iPad or your laptop, and we'll be winding the clock back 2,000 years to see what the sky looked like, to see if we can tell what the Star of Bethlehem might have been. And then I'll summarize at the end. So firstly, a reminder of what it is that we are trying to explain. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, there's mention of the Star of Bethlehem, and there are 5 particular properties which we are going to try and match up. So the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem, prompted by a star in the east. There it is in red. So the first thing we have to explain is, what do we mean by a star in the east? Bear in mind that the Magi saw a star in the east and then decided to go west. So to say that they followed the star is a little bit of a stretch, but we'll let that one go for the moment. They got to Jerusalem and asked King Herod, "What's this we hear about the birth of the King of the Jews?" So why would a star in the sky, why might it be interpreted as a sign of the birth of the King of the Jews? Herod was unaware of what they were talking about. So if this was a spectacular sight, why wouldn't the king be aware of it? The Magi journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared and then stopped in the sky. So we would like to find an astronomical candidate which matches those 5, or at least most of those 5 points in red. If we can find an astronomical candidate that matches those, maybe we found the Star of Bethlehem. So firstly, just a reminder of the familiar Christmas carol. In particular, the opening lyrics. Sing along if you like, I mean, that's okay. That's enough of that. Right, we 3 kings of Orient are. Where do you get 3 from? 3 magi, 3 wise men? No, the Gospel of St. Matthew doesn't talk about 3 wise men. It only talks about 3 gifts, and so people assume that there were 3 wise men. The 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, okay, maybe 20 of them arrived and only 3 brought gifts, and the other 17 said, "I didn't know we were supposed to bring gifts." So we really shouldn't have 3 there. I'm a physicist, I'm a scientist, I like accuracy, I like precision, so we shouldn't really have 3 in the Christmas carol because there's no justification for that. And where do you get kings from? There's nothing in the Gospel of St. Matthew about kings. The Gospel refers to magi, the plural of magus, a wise man. So we really shouldn't have kings in there either. Where did the Magi come from? Well, it doesn't say. It might have been Persia, it might have been India, it might have been Outer Mongolia. We don't know. So we really shouldn't have the geographic location in there either. So given that I've already said they saw a star in the east and went west, so the idea of following a star is a little bit ropey as well. So you can see the Christmas carol is rapidly falling to pieces here. And being a physicist, I thought, well, what should the Christmas carol actually be? To do it more accurately, we should really say, we, indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are, and we saw a star. Now, I know that doesn't meter quite as well as the original, and now you can understand why physicists don't write Christmas carols. And bear in mind, whenever you hear this expression about the 3 wise men, bear in mind it should really be the n wise men, where n is a number greater than 1 and less than infinity. Greater than 1 because magi is plural, And I gather there's a gender implication that they were male as well. Okay, let's return to the main problem of what was the Star of Bethlehem. Bear in mind that star doesn't mean star in the sense that we understand it today. Now we've got a good understanding of the universe around us. We know our sun is a star, and we know we have planets going around the sun. But hundreds of years ago, and certainly 2,000 years ago, the word star was used much more broadly to mean something in the night sky. And sometimes we still use those expressions. So for instance, what used to be called a wandering star, basically the stars are fixed, not in the sense they don't move in the sky. As the Earth rotates, the sky seems to move, so stars rise and stars set, but they are in fixed patterns, the constellations. So when people talk about fixed stars, they don't mean it's always in the same part of the sky, they mean it's always in the same pattern relative to all the other stars. And some of those dots of light were seen to move relative to the fixed stars. And so those were called wandering stars. We now know them as planets. Some of the stars were observed to have little tails on them. They were called broom stars or sometimes hairy stars. We now know that they were referring to comets. Icy bodies, when the comets get fairly close to the sun, the comet evaporates and forms a tail, which is often visible. So wandering stars, planets, hairy stars, comet, and one colloquialism that is still around even today, shooting stars, the expression for meteors, a tiny particle like something about the size of a grain of sand coming into the Earth's atmosphere, burning up and producing a streak of light. So let's remember that a star just means something seen in the night sky other than the moon. I think we can all figure out what the moon is. We see it all the time. Anything else could be referred to as a star. Do we get any hints by looking at paintings depicting the adoration of the Magi? Of course, these were painted many centuries after the Nativity, but do we get any clues? The Star of Bethlehem is usually depicted as a point of light, sometimes shining down onto Jesus. In the case of Botticelli, it's widely believed that this person on the right is Botticelli himself, photobombing his own painting, which is very clever. There at the back, Joseph, apparently looking very bored, not taking part in the celebration at all. Maybe that's appropriate because allegedly he had no part to play in the conception either. What else can we learn by looking at art? Well, again, the Star of Bethlehem is usually there. Giotto is one of the few artists who actually depicted the Star of Bethlehem as what appears to be a comet. Most other artists made it simply look like a star. This is one depiction of the adoration of the Magi where I actually couldn't find the Star of Bethlehem at the top, and perhaps to compensate for that, there appears to be a two-headed camel in the background there. Again, no particular clues. The star is usually there in the background of all of these paintings, but no surprise, these are not documentary evidence of the Star of Bethlehem, so we wouldn't expect to learn anything from these paintings. Whenever people looked in the sky, especially hundreds or thousands of years ago, they often attached astrological significance to what it is they were looking at. Every planet, every bright star, every constellation in the zodiac, remember the zodiac is the patch of sky through which all of the planets seem to move, and the moon. In other words, it's the plane of our solar system. That's how we understand it today. But in olden times, they simply knew that there was a pattern of zodiac constellations through which all the planets appeared to move. Virtually everything had some astrological significance. In other words, the very bright Venus, for instance, the brightest planet in the night sky, that was associated with beauty and fertility and birth. Jupiter is not quite as bright as Venus at its brightest, but Jupiter is also a very bright planet in the night sky, and that was associated with royalty and is often known as the king of planets. Today, we know that Jupiter is actually the largest of the planets, but of course that wasn't known at the time. They were just points of light in the sky. Regulus is the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, and as you can perhaps guess from its name, R-E-G, the first three letters, it's actually known as the king of stars. And the constellation of Leo itself, which looks a little bit like a lion, that was often associated, the lion in the sky was associated with the land of Judea because the land and the people of Judea basically identified themselves using a lion, as it were, on their flag. So there is various astrological significance applied to objects in the night sky. Why did people assume that the night sky held significance? Well, it was believed that that is where God spoke to man. In other words, if you wanted to know what was coming in the future, you would read it in the stars, literally as well as metaphorically. In other words, if you wanted to know, is the harvest going to be good? Are we going to have a famine? Are we going to have a flood? If you want to know about the future, you read it in the stars. And if you interpret the stars and the planets, etc., correctly, you can effectively predict the future. So one way of thinking of it is to say, well, really, the sky is God's Facebook page. That is where he posts anything of relevance to mankind. So astrologers need to be able to read the sky to know what God has in store for mankind. So what candidates can we think of? What do we know about today that could conceivably have been the Star of Bethlehem? Let's think of a few candidates, and then these 5 column headers here are the 5 pieces taken out of the Gospel of St. Matthew. Would it have been a star in the east? Would it be significant enough to make them think about a birth of the King of the Jews? And why wasn't Herod aware? Could the star reappear? Could the star stop in the sky? So let's have a look at a few possibilities. Could it have been a shooting star, for instance, a meteor? Well, meteors happen all the time. We know that there are many meteor showers during the year, and you can pretty much go out on any clear night, especially if you get away from light pollution, and you will see meteors probably every few minutes. So they are not unusual. If you can see a meteor a few times every night of the year, every year, why would a particular meteor be considered to be significant in any sense? So yes, it might appear in the east, but they would appear all over the sky. So that doesn't seem to fit the account of St. Matthew. What about the appearance of a comet? Yes, this particular icon looks more like a meatball than it does a comet, but let's assume it's a comet. Yes, a comet could appear in the east, indeed. Could it have been significant? Well, a bright enough comet would have been thought of as being a sign of something going to happen. But if it was really bright, why wouldn't Herod be aware of said comet? Herod's eyesight wasn't too good, but he had a court of astrologers, and they would have told him something really bright has appeared in the night sky. So possible, but doesn't quite fit the bill. What about a nova, a new star? Strictly not a new star, but a star that was originally dim, possibly too dim to see, that temporarily gets brighter and then appears in the night sky where there wasn't one before. Nova, we know, happen every once in a while. A really bright nova that would be considered to be significant, they might happen, let's say, once or twice every 100 years or so. So they do occur today, and we think they would have occurred hundreds of years ago. So it could indeed appear in the east, but if a nova is a new star which is fixed relative to all the other stars, why would you ever refer to the star stopping in the sky? Because the star would be fixed relative to all the other stars, so why would you talk about it stopping? That doesn't seem to make sense. Arguably, the same is true of a supernova, a star that's come to the end of its life and has blown itself to pieces. That could be spectacularly bright. We know of a few stars that are within a few hundred light years of us. When they die, they're massive enough that they will go supernova and they will be spectacular. Some will be bright enough to be visible not simply at night, but they will be bright enough to be visible during the day. So it could be absolutely spectacular. So yes, it could appear in the east and it could be significant, but generally speaking, once a star has blown itself to pieces, it doesn't tend to do it a second time. So the star reappearing in the sky doesn't make an awful lot of sense. And again, just like a nova, it's fixed relative to the other stars, so why would you talk about it stopping in the sky? There is a candidate, well, actually there's multiple candidates for the Star of Bethlehem that fall into the next category, and that is a conjunction of planets. A conjunction is a coming together of planets. That's the astrological symbol, that dumbbell there. Planets are going around the sun, all moving at different speeds, and although they stick to the racetrack of the zodiac, every once in a while they come close together in the sky. Generally speaking, all the planets are in orbits that are tilted slightly relative to the Earth's orbit round the Sun, so they tend to miss each other as they go backwards and forwards in the racetrack of the zodiac, but sometimes they get close, and if they're close enough, that might be considered significant by an astrologer. So let's make sure we understand what we mean by a planetary conjunction. The important concept here is that if we take two arbitrary planets going around the Sun, the one that is closer to the Sun feels a stronger gravitational pull and hence goes faster. So the inner planets go faster than the outer planets. It's not simply a question of got a shorter racetrack to go around, they are actually moving faster in terms of kilometers per second. So you can see the length of time it takes one planet to go around the Sun is significantly different from another if they're at different distances. And you can see that at this particular point, these two planets are in the same part of the sky. At other times of the year, they will be in different parts of the sky. So when planets are in conjunction, that might happen for a few days or a few weeks, and then later they'll be separated, and it's possible that those two planets can come back into conjunction sometime later. But the other important concept here is remembering that the inner planets go faster than the outer planets. We can think about what's going to happen if the inner planet is Earth, and we imagine seeing the sky from the viewpoint of the green planet here. If we were looking at one of the outer planets, like Mars or Jupiter or Saturn, that's as far as the ancients knew. They didn't know about Uranus and Neptune, for instance. Because the Earth is moving faster than these outer planets, if it's on the inside track moving faster, just like when you're going down the motorway, all the cars are traveling in the same direction, but if you overtake a car, for a little while, that car appears to you to be moving backwards, even though they're all moving forwards. The same can happen for planets. If we imagine they're all going around anti-clockwise in this particular view, then the outer planet, the one we're looking at there, will generally speaking seem to go from west to east as it goes around the Sun. But when the Earth overtakes it on the inside lane, moving faster than the planet, that planet will appear against the background of stars to move backwards. It's called retrograde motion. And so if we imagine what the planet looks like, it's moving from west to east, but when the Earth overtakes it, it stops and moves backwards for a little while, and then stops and moves forward again. So planets can stop in the sky. You can perhaps see where I'm going with this. Let's just run that again to remind ourselves. They go from west to east generally, but they can stop, move backwards for a little while, and then stop again and continue moving forwards as the Earth overtakes it on the inside lane. Okay, we'll come back to that shortly. Let's just have a look at the timeline of when we think Christ was born. You can see I've got a number of dates BC. If you ever try this yourself, getting an app and asking what does the sky look like 2,000 years ago, bear in mind that there is no year zero. If you go backwards from 3 AD, 2 AD, 1 AD, you don't get to 0 AD, you go straight to 1 BC. I'm telling you that simply because some apps don't get it right. Some apps introduce a year zero, so you'll always be 1 year off. So the question, when was Christ born? Simple answer, we don't know. We think perhaps, maybe, certainly in about 10 years between 10 BC and 0 BC, or sorry, 1 BC. So maybe Christ was born somewhere around here. Some people think somewhere around 6 BC, give or take a few years. That's based on the death of King Herod being 4 BC. But remember, the death of Herod isn't in a document saying King Herod died in 4 BC. If you find a document like that, you know it's suspicious. King Herod died after a lunar eclipse which followed this event, which followed that event, which followed some other event. Some historians believe that people have got the wrong lunar eclipse, and he didn't die in 4 BC, he actually died in 1 BC, in which case Jesus might have been born in a few years leading up to that point. I'm not quite sure, I'm no biblical scholar myself, I'm not sure why people believe there's a gap there rather than simply a large uncertainty in when Christ was born. Let's just take that as given for the moment. We know that there were comets in the sky. For instance, there was a bright comet around in 12 BC. How do we know that? Because we know where comets are now, We know how fast they're moving. We know how long it takes them to go around the sun. If we measure that accurately enough, we can simply wind the clock back 2,000 years and ask, when was this comet last seen in the sky? But winding the clock back generally for planets, for instance, is not a problem. Winding the clock back 2 million years might be problematic, but winding the clock back 2,000 years is easy. With the precision with which we can now measure planetary motion, it's easy to dial the clock back. So that, in fact, is Halley's Comet. We know how long it takes to go around the sun, and we can work out that Halley's Comet was in the sky in 12 BC and was probably quite spectacular. But isn't that a bit early for God to be posting on Facebook that something interesting is going to happen? There were other comets around. I won't bore you with these, but these would have been much fainter and almost certainly not visible to the naked eye. So we can't consider those to be Star of Bethlehem. What about nova? There are recordings from the Chinese in 5 BC and the Koreans in 4 BC that a new star appeared in the sky, a nova, visible with the naked eye. Nova tend to come around maybe once a century or so. What's the chances that two showed up within a few months of each other? Unlikely. It is far more likely that we've mistranslated the dates from the Chinese calendar and the Korean calendar. So those two observations of a nova are probably two observations of the same nova. But remember, nova, generally speaking, can brighten and appear in the sky, but if they do ever reappear, they reappear maybe decades or hundreds of years later. So it doesn't seem to fit the gospel. And also, why would you talk about it stopping in the sky? So let's have a look at conjunctions. Here I'm using the astrological symbols. That dumbbell means conjunction, and those two symbols stand for Jupiter and Saturn, and these two over here, Jupiter and Venus. So there were two conjunctions that some people believe might have been the Star of Bethlehem. There was one around 6 BC between Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter and Saturn were actually in conjunction a few years back. It was, 2021, Jupiter and Saturn were in the sky together in December. Did anybody see that? A few hands, but relatively few. If it was so unspectacular that very few people in this audience noticed that it happened, what's the chances that it was considered to be a significant event 2,000 years ago? However, and that's simply because Saturn is not a very bright planet. However, Jupiter and Venus are the brightest planets in the sky. If they ever get close together in the sky, you will really notice. So let's have a closer look using some software to see what's going on with this particular conjunction that occurred around 2 BC. So I'm using some software here, and I'm going to stare at the constellation of Leo because that's where all the action is. The zodiac is running top right to bottom left. Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, etc. are part of the zodiac. I'm not going to show where the horizon is. I'm not going to label everything because it just gets far too messy. There's Jupiter, and basically remember the planets are moving from west to east, from right to left. And so Jupiter is going to move to the left, and that's Venus coming up behind it. Remember, Venus is an inner planet moving a lot faster. So let's run the timeline forward. We're currently in August 3 BC. Let's run the video. Notice that Venus and Jupiter are close together in the sky. How might that be interpreted by astrologers? Venus and Jupiter are in conjunction in the constellation of Leo. Venus, birth. Jupiter, king. Leo, the land of Judea. Birth of the king of the Jews. So astrologers might have interpreted this particular conjunction as a sign relating to the birth of the king of the Jews. These planets would have been quite bright, but not particularly close. You could have separated them probably with your little finger. Still quite spectacular to see two bright lights in the sky, but they were definitely resolvable as two separate lights. And when did this happen? Well, this star would have been visible in the early morning before sunrise. It would have been a star in the east. And a star in the east telling the astrologers about a birth of the king of the Jews, and maybe you want to go to the land of Judea and talk to the king there. But they said, well, okay, maybe let's just watch the sky for a little while and see what happens. Venus is moving faster than Jupiter, so Venus moves off, and there's Jupiter now moving close to the star Regulus. That's the brightest star in the constellation of Leo. So the king of planets has just passed the king of stars. Jupiter has just passed close to Regulus. Now Earth is overtaking Jupiter on the inside track, which means Jupiter has stopped in the sky. The video is still running. Jupiter has stopped in the sky and is now starting to move backwards. Remember that retrograde motion I mentioned earlier. Jupiter passes Regulus a second time. The king of planets has passed the king of stars for a second time. Now the Earth has finished overtaking on the inside lane, which means Jupiter stops in the sky once more and then resumes its west to east motion and passes Regulus again. The king of planets has passed the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times in a row. Maybe the astrologers would say, something is interesting here, something about one king passing the crown on to another king, perhaps? Definitely worth keeping an eye on the sky to see what happens. Jupiter will continue its motion to the east, and here's Venus that's been round the sun and is back again. What happens if we continue watching the sky? There's Venus, and it is in conjunction with Jupiter again, some months after it did that the first time. We are now in the summer of 2 BC. This conjunction, unlike the last one, would have been absolutely spectacular, because rather than just have 2 bright lights miss each other in the night sky, these 2 bright planets would have come together and would have merged as if one. In other words, they were so close together in the sky, no human would be able to resolve them as 2 separate objects. 2 bright lights would have merged into one even brighter light. Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo, again, birth of the King of the Jews being stamped in the sky a second time. A conjunction this close doesn't happen very often. Perhaps a few times every 1,000 years you would get a conjunction like this. It's virtually a given that the astrologers of the time would never have seen anything like this in the night sky before in their lifetimes. Let's just see how close Jupiter and Venus are. Of course, we don't have telescopes 2,000 years ago, but let's imagine if this happened today and we got a telescope on it, how close would Jupiter and Venus be in the night sky? Let's zoom in so that we can see. They are so close together, the disk of Jupiter and the disk of Venus, at different distances from us, of course, those disks will appear to effectively touch. That's how close. This field of view that I'm showing here is much smaller than the field of view that a human could possibly resolve. The planets would have to be 10, 20, 30 times further apart to actually be resolvable as 2 points of light. So this conjunction was very bright and very spectacular. So let me summarize what we know happened and what it might have been interpreted as. We know that there was a conjunction in 3 BC of Venus and Jupiter in Leo, which might have been interpreted as birth of the King of the Jews. Sometime later, Jupiter passed Regulus. The king of planets passed the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times. A triple conjunction. Maybe that was something about one king handing the crown over to another king. The next year, in 2 BC, Venus and Jupiter were in conjunction again in a spectacular fashion where they would have appeared really bright in the sky. Maybe that was the starting pistol, telling the Magi, go and talk to King Herod. Is he aware of the fact that as king, he's going to be usurped by this new king of the Jews? How long did it take the Magi on deciding to leave their home to get to Jerusalem or Bethlehem? We have no idea, because we don't know where they came from. Persia, India, Outer Mongolia, somewhere in the Orient. Were they walking or did they have camels? According to the Christmas cards, they always have camels, but you don't actually know that. Christmas cards are not documentary evidence. It might have been that if they left in June, they might have got there many months later. And it's interesting to note that in that year, Jupiter once more stopped in the sky. It actually stops in the sky in December of that year. Which particular day does Jupiter, the king of planets, stop in the sky? The 25th of December. Now, complete coincidence, we know that Christmas Day is taking over a pagan festival of Saturnalia. The fact that it happens to be the 25th is sheer coincidence. So we know that these conjunctions happened. We know that they would have been spectacular. So the cartoons at the top and the items in red are astronomical facts, and we can time them to within minutes, possibly even seconds, 2,000 years ago. But the interpretation in black, well, we are guessing what the astrologers might have made of the sights that they saw in the sky. So maybe it was these conjunctions that were seen and would have been spectacular, they would have been amazing. Maybe they were seen by people, and the stories of this conjunction were handed down across the generations, across the years, and eventually the story of this conjunction became woven into the narrative of St. Matthew. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was that conjunction and a comet or something else. Maybe it was a combination of events. Determining the astronomical facts is not difficult because we know where things are now and we can calculate where things were 2,000 years ago. Astronomy is easy. Second guessing what the astrologers would have made of what they saw in the sky, well, we can only second guess, and that is all conjecture. But regardless, the underlying message is, of course, the same. And that is, I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas. Thank you all very much.